It was only a couple of weeks ago that we last spoke to Doug Liman, who in July was promoting his compact, $3 million war thriller The Wall. Now, he's back with another thriller, this one taking place over a much broader canvas. American Made tells the story of Barry Seal, a pilot who wound up running missions in and out of Central America for the CIA, taking cover photographs and smuggling in guns. The film's the perfect vehicle for Cruise, given that he gets to fly lots of planes, but then again, Barry Seal's hardly your typical heroic cruise lead. Seal earns a fortune running guns for the CIA and cocaine for the cartels. But he ends up as a pawn in a political game that he's barely even aware of. Liman directs the whole thing with his typical urgency and brio, and in person, he's just as effusive, full of stories about the real Barry Seal, the Iran-Contra scandal, and his own rebellious streak as a filmmaker. Here's what Liman had to say. "I loved working with Tom on Edge of Tomorrow, and it was on to the next. I wanted to work with him again. I loved working with Matt Damon and Brad Pitt. I've had amazing experiences with the actors I've worked with over the years. I've been really lucky in terms of the people I've gotten to work with. But I just look for material. I was sent American Made by a producer, Brian Grazer, and just fell in love with the character, Barry Seal. I just love this unapologetic outlaw rule breaker, who's doing it with an airplane. I love the world of the CIA in the 80s, the Cold War. We're starting to have Russia as an enemy now, but the Cold War was such a fun time. It provoked the United States to put a man on the moon, you know, like, literally. We did it just because we could do it before they did it. Some extraordinary things came out of this Cold War. All of those aspects of the story I loved. I'm gonna make this film, so who do I wanna cast? I couldn't help but think that Barry Seal's story is the opposite of Top Gun. Wouldn't it be fun to just cast Tom Cruise? But I didn't know. When I asked Tom about turning his character into a coward for Edge of Tomorrow, I didn't know how he'd feel about that, because traditionally, especially in action movies, he plays a very heroic character. He was so excited to play a coward in Edge of Tomorrow, he didn't just embrace it, he went really far with it. I thought he'd be pretty fearless about jumping into Barry Seal. So I sent him the script and he loved it, and he loved the idea of it. People think of Tom as being fearless when he comes to his stunts. But he's even more fearless in terms of his willingness to jump into characters that are so different than people think of him playing. They play to his weakness, but he plays into their weakness. I mean, everyone in American Made is flawed. There are no heroes in this story. The closest is his wife, who holds it together, the actress, Sarah Wright. Normally when you do a movie based on true events, you're like, okay, well the events are true, but probably the characterizations are exaggerated. In the case of Sarah Wright's character, Barry Seal's wife shared with us photos and other things of his life. And one of the photos she shared was a picture of her visiting him in a jail in Guatemala on his birthday, and she's cutting a birthday cake with a machete. She's in a jail that looks just like the prison he's in the movie. We're like, this is a woman who thought she was marrying a TWA airline pilot. Here she is, years later, and she remained in love with him. We not only didn't have to exaggerate in any way this Bonnie and Clyde love story, because if you look at the photos, it really was that. The other thing is, sometimes you cast a movie star to play a character, they suddenly become more attractive than the real person was. Think of Julia Roberts playing Erin Brockovich. The real Erin Brockovich just doesn't look like Julia Roberts. In the case of Fair Game, actually, Valerie Plame was as attractive as Naomi Watts. But normally, Hollywood tends to cast somebody more attractive both physically and from a character point of view than the real person. But Barry Seal was deeply loved by the people who knew him. Even a pilot who worked with us in Colombia, where we shot part of the film, and who had flown for Pablo Escobar, as all the pilots in Colombia seem to have done, said he knew Barry Seal and how much he loved Barry Seal. When he heard the film was about Barry Seal, he was, "Oh, I love Barry." Quote, "When I said, 'How did you know Barry?' he said, 'Oh, he stole an airplane from me.' Yeah, he came to look at an airplane and asked if he could take it for a test flight, and just took off and never came back. And that guy loved Barry." So his wife, who thought she was marrying a TWA airline pilot, and winds up having to visit him in a Guatemalan jail on his birthday, and loved him, and still loves him to this day. And this guy still loves him to this day. The people at the D who knew him that we met with loved him. He was like the largest drug smuggler in American history, probably. And the D agents who handled him loved him. In all honesty, I love that character. It's part of why the tone of the film is judgmental. You're kind of like, in a way, it's nice to feel like there are some people out there who are just free, kind of like a cowboy. The flying that he was doing in the 80s is not something you could do today. That era doesn't exist anymore. Because of GPS and all the technology that exists today, you couldn't get away with the kind of flying that he was doing in the 80s. So it's not just celebrating a character who's free, it's about celebrating a time when characters like that could get away with the outrageous things they did. It's reminiscent of the Wild West, the kind of outlaws we've often celebrated, like Butch and Sundance. I'm really interested in real people in extraordinary situations. The detail and reality to that. So there is a kind of journalistic approach of, like, how things would work, how they did work, or how they would work in the future, like Edge of Tomorrow. How would people really react in those situations? The more Hollywood version of American-Made would have made the CIA complicit in the drug trade, but the reality of how it worked was, the people who work at the CIA are rule followers. They believe in the mission, they believe in fighting communism, but they're recruiting from the top universities, they're the honor students, you know. They're not criminals, as much as people would want to brand people at the CIA as criminals. They're not. They crime maybe that they believe so much in their mission that they ignore facts that get in the way. But they're genuinely good people that believe in the mission. That ultimately is a more interesting movie for me because it takes a little digging to go beyond the superficial. The CIA are trafficking in cocaine. No, when you dig in a little bit, that sort of journalistic approach that you talked about, you're like, the reality's more interesting. You have people at the CIA who are decidedly not criminals, but the people they go and recruit are criminals. Because if you're going to find somebody who's willing to break the law and fly guns into Central America, then the person willing to do that, to break the laws and rules that are required to be broken, they're gonna be a criminal. So now you have the rule followers at the CIA in business with these criminals. And the criminals are criminals. They're not just gonna break the rules the CIA wants them to break, they're going to break whatever rules they wanna break. That's a more interesting dynamic. I've often found, as I did with Bourne, where I was inspired by the events of Iran-Contra when I designed the CIA for the Bourne franchise, that the reality of how things work is usually more compelling than the superficial, made-up version that Hollywood sometimes does. Yeah, well, certainly my father gave me exposure to the inner workings of Washington, which was interesting just on the mechanical level, whether it's in the Bourne identity, and also the absurd level of it, which very much went into American-made. When my father conducted the hearings into Iran-Contra, there were public hearings and then there were classified hearings. At the public hearings, the State Department asked my father not to identify countries by name because we had relationships with countries that were implicated, like Israel and Iran.